Hi everyone, thanks very much for coming along to how to lay the foundations for good storytelling in games. I've worked in the games industry as a writer now since 2005. I've worked both in the AAA field and in indie. Also worked as a consultant on over 400 AAA and indie games. So I've visited a lot of game developers, seen a lot of processes, seen a lot of things that work and don't work. Some of the game on with the FIFA The Journey trilogy, Destiny 2, Fable The Journey, Anomaly Wars on Earth, a bunch of other stuff. But anyway, let's get straight to it because we'd only have 15 minutes and I can talk about this stuff for hours. First of all, get the writer in early and collaborate. Don't leave it to the last minute. Now, it hasn't happened to me all that often, but I know a lot of writers who it has happened to, kind of being brought in at the 11th hour once a game is pretty much complete, and then asked to story over the top of that. Now, the issue with that is once you bring a writer in that late, all they can do is work with what they're given. It's not something that they've been working on from the very beginning. So what you often get is a really kind of disjointed story being tacked over a bunch of levels or some mechanics, and it often leads to really bad storytelling in games. So it's never too early to get a writer involved. Now, personally, I advocate bringing a writer in right at the concept stages. Thank you very much. So get the writer in, even when you're just kind of starting to plan what your game is. The writer can be there to work on the story, the characters, how things work together, and from the mechanics to the systems, and tonal as well. Tone is something overlooked in games. Often you'll see a game that will fluctuate between really serious tone and then a really zany tone and then back again, which means you get this kind of seesawing, inconsistent feel to the narrative. But if you bring a writer in early, they can start picking that and try and get that consistency. So plan game design and story side by side wherever possible. Now, in the industry, there is still a school of thought, and I think it's getting better, and certainly it has over 15 years. But there seems to be this kind of belief that design is over here and story is over here, and they're two separate entities. Now, what I'm saying is they're not two separate entities. They're actually the same thing, because story should be informing gameplay, and gameplay should be informing story. When we were doing the FIFA trilogy, for example, right at the beginning of each game, we would get into a room, we would talk through the mechanics, we would talk through the story, we would plan the game out. Now, obviously, in development, things change. Of course they change. We have to be open-minded to that as writers and as developers. But of course, if we're starting from a really strong foundation, where we're already trying to plan story and design together, then we can give a platform from which to start building really compelling stories. Now, give suggestions and feedback, but trust the writer. I've heard some horror stories from a number of writers over this, how they've been brought in and they've basically been asked to write Shakespeare, basically, but given a minimum amount of support and a minimum amount of trust. Even to the point where the stuff that they've been writing has either been read someone else in the development team who fancies themselves as a writer but actually isn't a writer, and that ends up giving us really bad results, because it's all very well saying, yeah, I like films and I really fancy writing a film, but writing, just like else within game development, is something that you craft over years and years and years. It's something that has to be learned, something that has to be developed. And that's why you bring a writer in. There's no point bringing a writer in then trying to supersede everything they do just by writing else. And just as a point of comparison, it would be a bit like the writer going to the lead artist. And as a group, we're generally not the best artists in the world when it comes to drawing, and insisting that the lead character should look something. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of what it's like from the writer's perspective when someone comes along and starts rewriting their work, and often not particularly well. So hopefully, in the future, writers will become more incorporated into the storytelling process. Next up, the shared understanding. Always communicate. Game development is a collaborative process. Now, I've traveled to developers around the world, both indie and AAA, And some are better at this than others, but some are really guilty of having little bubbles throughout the development team. The artists, the programmers, the thrillers, the level designers, etc. And they all kind of sit in their little bubbles and doing their little thing and not communicating with each other. So what you end up getting is a bunch of kind of disparate ideas that are all being developed in isolation that are then come together to be created. And it's the same thing with the story. When you're creating these things separately from the story, often you'll find things that don't necessarily make sense. So it's important for the development team to understand the demands of writing for games. This comes in several different things. First of all, in game development, we have to make changes. I mean, things will change. Things will go in and out of the game. Systems will be put in, they'll be taken out, they'll be iterated on, levels will be pulled out, they'll be put in. Now, when this happens, what you see when you're taking them out, it's like a stone being thrown in a pond. What you see is the splash. That's the level being taken out or something being changed. But narratively speaking, if you're ripping stuff out of your game, the ripple effect throughout the pond is what happens to the narrative. Everything within the narrative is structured to tell you, which means if you're pulling something out, you're probably going to be taking out a really important thing in the narrative that either pays something off or sets something up, leading to this really crazy, disjointed narrative that doesn't make sense. And how many times have we played games where the narrative makes sense? Often it's a case of things are pulled out the last minute, the writer isn't informed or consulted, and then at the last minute the writer is told that they have to fix it, which of course is virtually impossible when you have virtually no time to even write it, let alone redraft it. And it's just as important, though, for the writer to understand the demands and processes of designing and developing games. There's no point a writer coming in and not understanding how games are made. This isn't film, this isn't TV. Still, games is an element of making a game. It's not the be-all and end-all. So the writer needs to understand this when they come in. They also need to understand that there are certain limitations to what can be done. For example, in a film, you can go to a set, get some props, easily acquired, film it, and you're done. But if a writer comes in and starts writing scenes that are set in 20 different locations, an artist has to draw those, a 3D modeler has to model them, there are pipelines, there are time limits, there are sources that are limited. So a writer can't just come in and start doing anything that they want. They need to understand how games work. And it's important to have these conversations before you start the process to make sure that the writer understands what's going on. The same thing goes, and not much for indie, but for AAA, if you're using stuff like motion capture techniques, which have come a long way in the last 15 years, there are limitations there too. Like, for example, you can only have a certain amount of characters on screen at a time in some engines, or characters in some engines touch each other, or they can't interact with objects. So there's no point coming in and creating all these scenes that actually can't be done. So have those conversations with each other, talk to each other, collaborate. So just to sum that up, don't give the writer machine parts and ask them to build you a space shuttle. There's no point giving them a bunch of levels or something late in the day where you just want them to come in and tack a story on and expect it to be compelling, engaging, and incorporated into the gameplay. Not going to happen. So next up, make it organic. If it happens in the game, make it happen for a reason that makes narrative sense. Now, I've been to a lot of developers and seen a lot of process, and it's often this case, and it comes back to what I was saying about working in bubbles, where you'll see perhaps a level designer creating something, and the writer will walk along and go, well, what's that? And they'll go, I don't know, it just looked cool. It's like, but what is it? I don't know, it just looked cool. So if you're trying to create a world and a narrative experience and something immersive that takes you away from this world and it draws you into another world, and all of a sudden you come across stuff that simply doesn't make sense in that world, it totally and utterly rips you out of that moment and makes you think, well, hold on a minute, this is just a box in which people have dropped a bunch of cool looking stuff just for the sake of it. So again, have those conversations. All it takes is to go with the writer and say, look, I'm thinking about putting this, how can we make this work narratively? How can we make this work within our world and actually make it a convincing thing? So infuse level design and scripting with narrative, character development, backstory, and so level design in many ways is a very kind of logical process. Ultimately, if you think about it in its most basic form, it's a box in which we drop stuff in where stuff happens. Go from point A to point B, maybe triggers some other fight, go to point C, solve a puzzle, go to point D, pick something up. Now, if you're working with the writer can infuse those things with a narrative vein that actually gives them extra emphasis and believability. So again, be having those conversations and make use of every narrative tool at your disposal. Walk and talks, books, diaries, radio broadcast, barks, environmental storytelling. It all depends on the type of game you're making. But even a really simple puzzle can be embellished with a good little story. One of the indie games that I worked on was called Spooky Spirits, a simple puzzle game. But we infused it with a story about two ghosts who are kicked out of the spirit world because they've messed up. And you as the player have to help there simply by solving these puzzles. And each time you see the next part of their story and you help them redeem themselves. And that instantly gives a narrative threat to what is just a puzzle game ultimately. But there are tons of different things you can do. Look at something like Sky, for example, the way they tell stories in a myriad of different ways, or the books that you can find, all of the NPCs you come across. The Witcher 3 does it superbly, where every character you come across feels like they're actually believed. I'm sure we've all played RPGs where the side quests are just basically tacked on. You walk up to someone and it's a sheep farmer, and he goes, someone's stolen my sheep. Can you go and get the sheep for me? You go and get the sheep for your sword at the end. And that doesn't really mean anything within the context of the world in which you're playing. However, The Witcher 3, what they did is that every side story felt like it was somehow connected to the main story, the world in which you were in. They built this incredible world, and then they utilized it, not just for the main quests, but for the side quests too. So there's loads of different ways that you can be doing this. And for me, perhaps the most important thing, narrative in games, is making the player care about what they're doing. This is what narrative can do. It can take a set of mechanical actions, go over there, shoot this thing, solve this puzzle, and it can make them think to the player. Again, we're building worlds, we're building experiences. We want to take the player away from their day-to-day lives and make them believe that they're here. So narrative is about more than setting up what to do in the next level. One of the biggest missed opportunities, I think, when it comes to narrative in games is this idea that before a mission, whether it's just a mission text or a mission briefing or an expensive cutscene, we're spending too much time telling the player what they need to level, rather than trying to tell story, rather than trying to show character, rather than trying to show motivation about why is this important, why should we care about this, what are the stakes. So think about those things, even if it's just text or even if it's a nice cutscene. What can I tell you about the characters and why what I'm about to do is important to them, and how I as the player can make a change for them in terms of what their lives are like, or the things they want to achieve, or the things that they need. So raise the stakes. Story and writing should give additional meaning and emotional heft to the gameplay. So imagine this, you're heading towards a big battle, and next to you are a bunch of NPCs. And you know that a visceral battle, it's going to be a bloody battle, it's going to be really, really, really difficult. But the guys next to you have no personality, they're a bunch of stereotypes, something pulled out of an 80s action movie. So basically you go into this battle and they start all around you, and you don't care. You don't care. All you care is whether you get to the end, because that's your goal as the player. Now imagine doing the same level again. This time the guys next to you, you've spent time with them, you understand who they care about them, you know what their fears are, you know what their hopes are. When these guys die next to you, you're going to care. You're going to want to protect them, and you're going to want to play the game in a whole different way, not just by being gung-ho, running off, doing all the shooting, and who cares if they die. Suddenly you become comrades, you become friends with these people. That's what we can do with narrative. We can create these AI drones and give them a personality and make us care about them as human beings. So create deep, interesting characters with believable motivations, desires, needs, pain, strengths, weaknesses, etc. How often do we see one-dimensional characters in games? How often do we see cookie-cutter villains who are for the sake of being evil? Try and explore who these people are. Where did they come from? What motivates them? What made them who they are today? And what are they trying to achieve? Not just world domination, but world domination for a reason that's motivated thing. You know, where have these characters come from and what's influenced them? If you can really kind of explore that and start getting into those things about what they want and what they need and about the stuff that scares them and excites them, then all of a sudden we can start creating those emotional engagements and create moments where we do feel like we want to smile or we want to cry or we want to look after these people or we want to work with them. So ultimately it's about together, creating that process where we're talking together, whether it's the writers or the designers and the artists, all getting together and all pulling in the same direction to create a world and create an experience and create a narrative that can create a much more compelling and engaging gameplay experience. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Nina.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and absolutely, I love that line you were saying about raising the stakes. And I think that's the critical thing. We often don't talk about how important that is, and that kind of pivotal placing the player as part of a dilemma, a kind of a process that locks them into that world, I think is absolutely critical. And it doesn't have to be a complex world. It can be just in the simplicity, as Natasha was saying, and the visuals of how you express it.
Absolutely.
But unless you ground it in a great storytelling concept, I think you've got no chance of doing that. So has anyone else got any questions? I will happily talk hours, as we all know. So if anyone has any questions, please put your hand up. But I just want to sort of pursue that a little bit further. So, I mean, again, I'm often in the situation where I'm a kind of designer. I'm trying to convince the team to get the writer. I think it's the kind of one thing I should do to kind of convince the guy with the money that writer on the team at the day one really matters. How do you go about convincing that?
So I think what it is there's throughout games for the last 20 years, you know, writing has come under a huge amount of criticism, and I think a lot of that has come down to the processes that we implement in terms of creating games. Now, similarly, well, let's not bring in a level designer. Let's not bring in, a concept artist. Let's not bring in a designer. Let's not bring in a producer. All of these things are given. It's like, well, obviously we need those things. And like narrative has become such a massive part of this game industry and such a massive way of embellishing gameplay and making it more emotional, engaging, that the idea of not bringing a writer in early, to me, is almost as nonsensical as not bringing any of those other people in. So perhaps maybe that way of convincing the money men that, you know, they're just as important as everybody else, and if they can be there early on, we can make a better game. So.
No, exactly. And we had this problem with, I was working on a game called Reality Clash, which is a location-based shooter game, and it needed a narrative hook to explain how the game plays. I ended up having to write it, and I'm not a writer. I mean, I like writing, but I'm not a writer like yourself. So it's something that keeps coming up time and time again. Does anyone else had a question? You know, there was a question. Go for it. Yeah.
So you were talking about when content gets cut, and obviously there's narrative elements in the content that's been removed from the game. Obviously, like when you're trying to ship, things always get cut. So do you have any sort of tips for how you can mitigate against the inevitable point at which you have to cut content in order to ship, but that has an effect on the narrative, maybe making it not make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, what I found often happens in games is that things get ripped out without consultation with the writer. Now, you don't need the writer's permission. Of course you don't. This is game development, right? We understand how this works, or at least writers should understand how this works. If something is going to get pulled out and ripped out, get the writer in immediately and talk to them about, look, we're thinking about making these cuts. Right? What impact is that going to have on our story? and how can we mitigate the impact? So there might just be that there are important bits of information in the bit that you're ripping out that can be placed elsewhere in the game. And if you give the writer the heads up, they can be planning, it's not going to be perfect, of course not. But if they can at least be thinking about it and planning that, hey, look, this thing is set, we've ripped it out. This thing is paid off there and we've ripped it out. Where else can we be doing that? Can we put it into VO? Is there a cheap way that we can do it quickly to patch it up to at least keep making it feel consistent and make sense? Better for it to not be done, but at least feel consistent, than to not be done at all and to be nonsensical. So, have those conversations and, and give the writer at least that ability to patch things up and move things around to try and keep it consistent. That's what I would recommend to you anyway.
I mean, whoever's the product owner has to take that responsibility to make sure that happens, because if they're not defending the player experience, they can't defend it without the writing and the art and all the other stuff as well. So, sadly, I say thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much.
That was fantastic. Thank you.